The other question is this the last we'll see of the temple? And if this is not the last we'll see of the temple, then there'll be a future prince, which we say is the Antichrist. Now, that still hasn't answered the question about.
I'm not saying that Titus was this prince.
No,
the people of the prince,
right,
will destroy the city. In other words, the region, the people.
Here's what you have to understand. With this scripture here, what was not seen is that there's to be two destructions of Jerusalem. We're talking about a double fulfillment. We're talking about a type and an antitype, a down payment, an installment of something that we can see as an example that's instructive to us, because this will come again.
Two mountain peaks.
Right, because at the end of this destruction, a consummation and an end has to come. If this is not the end in Daniel 9, then it's the single exception, because in 7, 2 and 7 and 8 and 11 and 12, it's always to the end. So starting this out here, this would have to be the only exception, because this is the most debated passage in this entire book right here. And this is a make or break issue as to whether or not the people of God will know that there is a preliminary half week or 3.5 years before the final tribulation. Many dispute whether there is a final tribulation, but many that agree that there is are okay with that, have a real problem with the idea that the entire 7 years is future. I'm going somewhere with this, to answer your question. So if this prince is Titus, then one of the ways that they have understood this is, will it be the people of the prince that will be involved in the destruction of the last temple, okay? That will stand in, that will be the so-called third temple, or as they call it, the tribulation temple. So therefore they reckon or reason that, well, then Titus was a Roman. The book of Revelation seems to talk about Rome and things like that. So therefore it's reasonable to conceive that the people that will attack Israel under the Antichrist will be the people of Western Europe. In this case, it would be Italy or Europe or whatever. So that the theory of the 10-nation comet market countries, you know what I mean, which is the popular theory today, is which I think it's almost suspect for the company it keeps, because it's invariably almost always pre-tribulational. And so they're looking for a revived Roman Empire and a Western European, and that's going to produce the comet. But this is talking about a future prince that is not Titus, that Titus was a mere figure or type of. You with me here? This is talking about the Antichrist. So both the prince and the people are both future. Okay. That's my answer.
Yes, okay.
Because it relates to the last week.
We'll come to the rest of the issues as we go.
Yes. Well, let's go ahead and why do we define this prince, little p, as Antichrist? Look, verse 27. And he. What's the antecedent to he? It's talking about this prince who's coming, that's going to destroy the city and the sanctuary.
Well, that's the debated issue.
Yes.
You understand, because the question is, which is the he that confirms the covenant, because that's the same he that will stop the sacrifice. So if you say that he is Messiah the prince, well, then he confirms the covenant, then he stops the sacrifice by his cross, it's believed. But if we say that the he is the nearest antecedent, which is the usual thing in grammar, then that would then be the prince that shall come, which is as we've said, the Antichrist, or the embodiment of this last mystery, because the same one that would confirm the covenant then would also stop the sacrifice.
Yes.
So the question here for theology and for interpretation is, who stops the sacrifice? Is it the good guy? Is it Jesus, or is it the bad guy? See what I mean? That's the question, and that's what we're wrestling with here.
Okay, so he, and I believe it's the nearest antecedent, will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, 1/7. This is the last 7 to make this Shavim. This is with 69 we've covered already. This is the final 7. He will make a firm covenant with many for 1/7. But in the middle of that 7, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. Okay, so all of a sudden we've got it divided. If we only had a calculator, we'd determine what half a 7 was.
If we only.
3.5 years in, he will stop, put an offering, it will stop the sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations. Some say on the wing of a temple. there will be set up an abomination. What is the best translation on this one?
I
On
like
the
the-
wing of abominations.
I like the translation that for the overspreading of abominations.
For the overspreading of
In
abominations.
other words, the abomination that's accomplished in the temple will have a ripple effect. It'll go
Yes.
out like a wing, and
Yes,
it'll
okay.
flare out across all of Jerusalem,
Meaning in Hebrew.
bringing the desolation.
Mark, is that word kanaf? Like, Mark, is that word kanaf, the wing of abominations? Do you know offhand?
It's
It
also
would be like a covering.
it's also translated pinnacle.
You can look in the Hebrew. I've
The
got a
wing
Hebrew
or the
Bible
pinnacle
over
of
here.
the temple, which suggests he puts this in a public place. It's put in the holy place to begin with, but it's also displayed on the wing or the pinnacle of the temple. That's another thing you get from the Hebrew.
But this word abomination, does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
Is this the first time this appears in the book of Daniel? This word abomination?
Let the reader understand.
Yeah.
Yes.
This was when you really began to see that we're searching out a mystery.
We're talking about a word,
Yeah.
abomination. And on the wing of abomination, the overspreading of abominations, will come one who makes desolate. Abomination, desolation, that word desolate. So, we're talking about destruction here. Desolation is raising a city. What we read in Zechariah, the city will be taken. It's going to be plundered. That's a good word, plundered. Desolate. Will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. So again, this guy is going to come in and make desolate, and then a complete destruction is going to be poured out on him, the one who makes desolate.
broken without hand.
Broken without hand.
That's right.
Yeah.
And again, this vision ends with the second coming of Jesus.
Yes.
Who is it that's going to destroy and make desolate? This one that has done this destruction. Jesus will destroy him with the spirit of his mouth and the brightness of his coming. Yes, brother.
Yeah, I wonder if somebody can comment on the wording here seems to indicate that destruction, the end thereof, which is with the flood, and under the end of the war, desolations are determined, seems to come after 62 weeks, not after 66.
You mean 69.
Weeks, or 60.
69.
So,
Well,
just the order of the way it's shown seems to indicate that it would be at the beginning, coming prince here, rather than in the middle when he cuts off
The
sacrifice.
Messiah, the prince, is cut off after the 69th week. So that's behind us now. And now the question is, which of the two princes is the one that confirms the covenant and breaks the takes away stops the sacrifice? And we know that happens in the middle of the week. So what are you saying?
the wording here about that indicates precedes what happens during that last week.
You're talking about the flood of persecution?
How does it say it? The prince that shall come shall destroy the city and sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with the flood. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. So you have to kind of
Well, the typical fulfillment happened in 70 AD. There's no question about that. And that anticipates that. So this is like you have this in Daniel a lot. You have it over in Daniel 11, where there's like a preview. There's a snapshot of what's about to happen, and now the prophet's going to go back and drop back and then move toward that, which was previewed in just the passage before. I'll give you a perfect example. This very flood here, I believe we find it in Daniel 11. If you look, verse 22. So this is not the time for Daniel 11 as far as detail. But you know, the way to interpret Scripture is especially within that book, and then only then do you move out to the other books of the Bible. So within the book of Daniel itself, here's some keys for us. In Daniel 11:21, we're going to make a case that Daniel 11:21, of course, is the Antichrist. This is the introduction of the Antichrist. Well, look, in verse, so he comes in by flatteries, like we've been talking about this. He comes in with stealth and craft and all. Then in verse 22, you have a preview of what doesn't completely happen until verse 31. Verse 22 says, and with the arms of a flood shall they, the Jerusalem that's about to be made desolate by this guy, shall they be overflown from before him. Other prophets talk about the land being covered like a cloud and trodden underfoot and all that. Well, this is a preview passage. And then it says, and they will be broken, yea, even the prince of the covenant. And so here we see the covenant in relationship to a future Antichrist. You with me? So this is something that most people want to see the covenant in relationship to Jesus. He came and confirmed the everlasting covenant. He began to preach with the preaching of John 3.5 years later. And it is interesting. Listen, it's compelling. I appreciate the mystery of something going on here, because Christ did indeed die 3.5 years later. And he did show that forever the once and for all sacrifice has been accomplished. So there's some interesting things here that's paralleling here that's amazing. But in that place, though, here you see the covenant and a flood. We just got through hearing about the overflowing of, you see the flood. But then look at verse 23. Now, so 22 is a preview. You have this again in Daniel 12. You'll have a preview, then you'll have a development of what the preview announced what's going to happen, and then the prophet will drop back and take a point of departure, and he'll move to that very point. So this verse 22 anticipates verse 31, which is the taking away of sacrifice and the abomination. But in verse 23, he tells you the progression of how you get there. So in verse 22, you're seeing the flood, the covenant, all that's going to come. Mm-hmm. But now verse 23 drops back and gives you a chronology of how you get there. Mm-hmm. Verse 23 starts this way, and after the league, the covenant made with him, he begins to work deceitfully, come up with a small people, and become strong. And on it goes at a time of security. This is the first half of the week, the false security. Mm-hmm. There's some military engagements and so on. We're not going to get into detail of that. But where does it end? It takes you to the abomination. And the abomination, we know, happens in the middle of the week. Because if you'll turn to, just with me real quickly, turn to the next chapter 12. Turn to chapter 12. Now look at verse 11. And from the time the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate. There it is again. See what I mean? Mm-hmm. There's 1,290 days. Now, brothers, that's exactly approximately 3.5 years. This is the half week. This is the last half of the 7 years. The question that concerns us most is this the last half of a larger 7 years? It certainly is, because the sacrifice that's taken away here, we're going to make a case, is the same sacrifice that's taken away in Daniel 9. It's got this flood, it's got this covenant, it's got this man of sin. There's two mysteries here. God is not content till both are accomplished in history. There's the mystery of godliness, we have that at the first coming. There's the mystery of iniquity, we wait for that. Yes. And this whole thing is constructed around two princes. They have a heavenly counterpart and an earthly. There's an incarnation. Yes. Christ, the Messiah, the prince that shall come. The prince that shall come is the little horn. And it just adds right up. And the little horn, how long does he prosper and practice? 3.5 years. When does that happen? It's when he stops the sacrifice. And in all these references, you'll see that the sacrifice is always and invariably, if there's any exception, it would only be this one. But in all the other instances, and that's all we have to compare with, the sacrifice is stopped by the one that magnifies himself, the one that exalts himself.